Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 5 of the SOFT virtual conference. We are excited. We have got a packed day today. It's just going all day long. You can go to the website, trisomy.org, to check that out. But let's just get started with our first activity. And just to let you know, if you haven't been on before, you are muted. And if you have a question, if you'll remember it, great. If not, write it down so you'll remember it, because we'll take all questions at the end. And what we'll have you do is either you have the chance of either raise your hand. You have an option on your screen to raise your hand, or at least you will once we open that up. And then also you have the ability to put a message in. You can type a message in the chat, either one, to ask your question, and we'll go through and get all of your questions answered with our speaker at that point in time once we're done. And so let's just move right on with our day. Laura Lindberroth is our speaker this morning. She's Director of Programming and Community Engagement at Rainbows for All Children. Now, how appropriate is that for SOFT, right? Committed to expanding the number of peer support groups, adapting and equitable training and curriculum to best support all children, and ensuring use of evidence-based research. Laura was a Peace Corps HIV volunteer in Jamaica. She's led capacity building projects for public health, including children's malnutrition and disaster relief efforts in Haiti, smoking prevention, cessation, and policy implementation, and health promotion for youth. She has a BS in communication from Boston University and a Master of Public Health and International Health and Development from Tulane University. She lives and works in Evanston, Illinois with her chef husband. Wow, that would be nice. And their 3 daughters. And so please help me welcome Laura Lindberroth. Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here today, and I really appreciate you giving me this opportunity. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have a quick little presentation to show you all. And just make sure you can see that. Let's see, is it starting? From beginning. Okay, there we go. Can you see that okay? I'm assuming you can.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so go ahead and get started. I'm just gonna take myself out of the corner here for a second. Okay. So, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about what we do at Rainbows. We provide support groups all over the world to children and teens who are grieving from a variety of losses. As was read to you a little earlier, my background and training is in public health, specifically for global health and development. But knowing the impact that loss and trauma can have on health, and being in public health and preventive health, I mainly focus on intervention strategies that can really help to reduce the long-term effects of things like the impact of a pandemic, for instance, or all these different things that we go through. And as you can see here, some of the things that we see a lot of children coming in for, things like a death in the family, separation or divorce, a parent or sibling who's been incarcerated, somebody that's been deported or deployed, or a significant illness that's going on, or a chronic medical condition in the household. Just to be clear, I am not a mental health professional, but I do have over 5 years of training and certifications in grief, loss, and trauma, and over 25 years in preventive health. I am going to just see if I can pull this thing up for a second. Okay, there we go. Okay, so our tagline at Rainbows is guiding you through the storms of life, which is what we're going to attempt to do with this talk today, is kind of talk a little bit about what that means. We advocate for children and teens, and very often that's helping people, adults mostly, understand how children grieve differently than we do, and how we can best support them in that process. So, for the past 37 years, we've served close to 4 million children by providing them support and helping them to develop and strengthen problem-solving and coping skills, anger and stress management, alleviate depression and anxiety, improve their communication skills, and reduce their emotional pain and suffering. I'm honored to have been asked to present to you all some of the important things to understand about grief and loss as it pertains to the siblings of children with trisomy or other related disorders. I'm going to talk about grief mainly as it relates to the death of a sibling. However, at Rainbows, we do address all sorts of different losses, as I explained, and including the grief that may accompany living with a sibling who has an ongoing medical condition. What's important to understand is that the way that we can support a child or teen who's grieving is the same regardless of the type of loss. Based on what we've learned from working with grieving youth since 1983, these are the 4 guiding principles of the Rainbows program. The first, adults often don't recognize when children are grieving. This is because grief is often misunderstood. It's a powerful and natural emotion, yet in the midst of loss, each child's experience is unique. How a child grieves depends on the loss, the amount of love that's been invested in what has been taken away, the relationship that was shared, and how the loss occurred. When loss occurs, children are hit by a myriad of emotions. Their minds and hearts are battered by an onslaught of strange and scary and unpredictable feelings. They're often frightened by the intensity of their anguish and confusion. Children really don't know how to grieve, and the consequences of this can be devastating. Children and teens often are left with no one guiding them through the turbulent storms of grief. After a life-altering traumatic event, caregivers are frequently immersed in their own pain and cannot provide adequate support for their children. Alone, many of these children and teens turn to destructive and even life-threatening behaviors as a means of coping with their overwhelming emotional pain. Children don't distinguish between the pain of loss that results from death and the pain of loss that results from other traumatic events. Adults do, but children don't. Children experiencing those losses grieve just as deeply as those who have had a family member die. They're not conceptual thinkers, and so therefore they cannot differentiate between the types of loss. They only know that someone is missing. I mention this because of the significant illness or the chronic medical conditions that can present in a baby or a child with trisomy and other related disorders. As I'm sure many of you are aware, living with someone with a significant illness or a medical condition can also cause many of the same feelings of grief and other emotions as any other loss. Children can heal from loss. That's the good news. Grieving children and teens really need that guidance and help. They can't negotiate grief's emotional abyss alone, but they can survive and even thrive if they're supported and given the tools to grieve. This is a short video from one of our Rainbows alum who's sharing her experience of being in a support group as a young child.
I was 8, maybe 9 at the time. Like, it's not easy to tell somebody how you feel. It's not easy to tell somebody the things that are going on. It's not easy to, say I hate my life, or I feel like hurting myself, or I can't stand being in my house, and how do you say those things? But being able to do the program and the worksheets through the Rainbows program, it really helped me to put to words how I was feeling, so that I just didn't sound like some rambling kid, or I didn't sound like somebody that was making a ton of stuff up, or I didn't sound like somebody that was just saying whatever. And it made me feel sane.
Children express grief in a multitude of ways. Their actions reflect their ages and personalities, the intensity of their feelings, and their family situations. These are some of the things that children and teens want us to understand about their grief. For children, the grieving process is different. Minutes after they've been told a loved one has died, they might run outside and play. It isn't because they don't feel deep sorrow, but rather they're only able to grieve for short periods. Their lack of emotional maturity simply doesn't allow them to sustain intense pain for long periods. We call these intermittent bouts of grief sad attacks. Sad attacks are spontaneous. They come without warning and cannot be prevented. Anything that reminds children of the people who are missing from their lives can trigger a sad attack. A bereaved child can be in the middle of playing a game, doing homework, or even watching TV when a commercial, song, or an image washes over him with memories of the past. If a child is working through their grief, sad attacks occur with less frequency over time, although they never cease entirely. Years later, a memory or an event can trigger a bout of sadness. Sad attacks are healthy. They give the grieving child time to reflect on and revisit their grief. They help them assess how far they've come, and it also helps them move forward in the work of healing. Grief is the normal and human reaction to a significant loss or change in our lives. When a loss occurs, even children who are too young to articulate what is missing know that something important, a voice, a touch, is no longer part of their lives. And even young babies can frequently sense when a person is missing, and they'll often react with a change in behavior, sometimes becoming fussy or irritable or needing to be held constantly. Basically, if a child is old enough to love, they are old enough to grieve. 16-year-old Luke knew that his younger brother, Matt, was seriously ill. Matt was diagnosed with leukemia 6 months earlier and had been hospitalized for long periods since. Their parents openly discussed the treatments that Matt had to undergo, but they never acknowledged that Matt might die. Luke thought it was just a matter of time before his brother would be healthy again and back to normal. One afternoon, Luke walked in the door after school and found his parents and sister sitting in the living room. They looked stricken and sad. His mother burst into tears. "Matt's dead," she blurted out. Luke didn't say a word. He ran from the room, grabbed a basketball, and started shooting baskets in the driveway. When he finally ventured inside more than an hour later, his parents were angry. "How could you leave? You should have been here with us," his dad said. "Aren't you going to cry? Doesn't it matter to you that your brother is dead?" his mom demanded. Luke shrunk away. Later, he came to his parents and admitted that he was confused by and ashamed of his own behavior. "I didn't want Matt to die," he said. "I never knew anyone who died, and when it happened, I didn't know how to act or what to do or how to feel." Stunned by the news, Luke desperately tried to make life seem normal. So he did what he routinely did after school. He shot baskets. It was, he acknowledged to his parents, a way to deny the truth he couldn't face and to avoid the horrible, sad feelings that were washing over him. Children also grieve for reasons that are not always apparent to adults. The changes that occur after loss can be confusing and frustrating and appear chaotic to children who prefer normal routines and schedules that make life more manageable. Those changes can cause them to worry and add stress to the grief that they're already experiencing from losing the person. Our culture doesn't prepare children for loss. As a result, feelings of grief are alien to our youth. Many children, especially the very young, don't even know the words to describe their emotions. Often grief is expressed through misbehavior or physiological ailments like headache or stomach ache. If loss occurs and no one talks to children about how the family life might change, they're left to create their own fantasies about the situation. And though some of those fantasies can seem absurd to adults, to children they're very real and very scary. As children mature into adolescence, they learn how to express their feelings verbally and should be better equipped to cope with loss. Rarely, however, do adults talk to them about what has happened. I've had teens say to me, "If these feelings are a normal reaction to loss, then how come not one adult has ever talked to me about them? They talk to me about all these other things like drinking and driving or sex or being home by curfew." Grieving teens are left thinking that their feelings are weird and unacceptable. Worse, they may lose their grip on reality. In Florida, one 17-year-old overweight girl thought that if she starved herself, her mother, who had died from a brain aneurysm, would come back to life. My weight problem was the only thing we ever argued about, she said. I thought if I got skinny, it would change everything and Mom would come back. Grief is such a small, unassuming word, and yet it collapses even the strongest adults. Perhaps this is why so many people are afraid of it and hesitant to talk to children about loss. When we think of grief, we think only of pain and suffering. And yes, those are very initial, real reactions that we have with loss. But if we learn to look at grief as a process that moves us from one place in life to another, from one level of personal development to a higher level of existence, it becomes possible to take a more positive look at grief and present that view to children. This is one child's story from Rainbow's late founder, Susie Yale Marta's book, Healing the Hurt, Restoring the Hope, which is a great resource for an even deeper dive into understanding how children and teens grieve and how to best help them through the process. Late one hot summer night, a 6-year-old Chicago girl named Faisha awakened to find her dad and uncle arguing in the kitchen. The two exchanged angry words and began shoving each other around the cramped room. Then, while Faisha watched helplessly, her uncle grabbed a knife off the kitchen counter and plunged it into her father's chest. The police were at the scene in minutes. Soon after, Faisha was remanded to the care of a state agency and placed in a temporary shelter, while authorities searched for her mother and other relatives. Although Faisha's shoulder-length black hair had been hastily brushed into 2 uneven pigtails, she still wore her pajamas and slippers when she arrived at the shelter. Breakfast was being served, and Faisha was hurriedly seated at the table with several noisy children. Exhausted and in shock, Faisha slumped down in the chair and stared at her fingers. Soon a staff worker arrived with a platter of food and began serving the other children. "What's wrong, honey?" the woman asked the frightened child. The little girl looked up, eyes brimming. "I saw my daddy get killed last night," she whispered sadly. The other children stopped eating and glanced nervously at each other. The staff worker froze in place. There are many things the woman could have said or done to help Faisha at that moment. But she was so flustered, so distressed by the child's horrible experience, she could not think of a single appropriate response. Here, dear, have some French toast," she said and hurried away. The traumatized little girl was left to a pain-filled silence and the stares of the other children. Faisha needed someone to bear witness to her story, someone willing to take on a tiny portion of her great burden of grief by listening to what she had to say and acknowledging the horror that she had witnessed. But instead of a compassionate listener, she got food. Adults do that a lot. We offer the grieving child material goods, ice cream, a second serving of cake, candy, a new dress, better inline skates, the latest designer jeans, because we don't know what else to offer. We don't know how to respond to pain-filled statements with words. We don't know the questions to ask that will prompt grieving children to share their emotional pain. Often, grieving youth are left to their own inner silence because we, the adults in their lives, won't listen to them. We don't let them talk about the loss event. Uncomfortable with grief, we don't want them to discuss their anxieties. We ignore their feelings and hope that the grief will resolve itself and go away on its own. It doesn't. Ironically, not all troubled responses are obvious. At the other end of the spectrum are the grieving children and teens who carry on without any noticeable change in their personality or lifestyle. It's tempting to breathe a sigh of relief and say, "Oh, thank goodness this kid is fine," when a child moves through a loss experience with what appears to be perfect equanimity. But sometimes those children have simply stuffed their feelings deep inside. Unless they're able to acknowledge their pain to themselves or to someone else, children will never fully work through their grief. It will haunt them throughout their lives. This can affect their future relationship with a partner, the way they operate at work, the way a parent They parent their children, and more. Unresolved trauma or grief can even lead to poor health outcomes and shorten life expectancy. Grieving a serious loss like a death takes years to complete. Oddly, the first year is usually the easiest. The grieving child is numbed by their loss, and family, teachers, friends tend to be the most understanding and supportive at this time. The magnitude of loss usually sets in during the second year, just about the time that everyone assumes the child is finished grieving. They're really just beginning. It usually takes 3 years after the loss for the intensity of the pain to diminish enough to allow the grieving child to begin reconstructing a new life. By the 5th year, the child or teen is usually able to experience happiness and promise once again. By not allowing children time to grieve, adults prolong the process for them. All too often, well-meaning parents, grandparents, and teachers tell grieving children to, quote, be strong for their parents, behave, or keep up those grades. Translated to a child or adolescent, this well-intentioned advice means don't talk or think about your loss. Rather than deal with their feelings or needs, grieving children bury or deny their emotions. Consequently, the grief may linger beneath the surface for years. Children's grief should never be ignored. The consequences are too great. When children and teens suppress the powerful emotions of grief, really disclaiming or ignoring them, they use an incredible amount of energy to obscure the powerful feelings. This energy is diverted away from school, sports, hobbies, jobs, and other positive opportunities in their lives. It's part of their potential, and it's lost forever. Repressed grief does not dissipate. It simmers within. Sometimes it's expressed through chronic health problems. Invariably, it subtly shapes and influences the child as they grow up and become an adult. Submersed grief colors their outlook on life. At work or with friends, they'll tend to be cynical and treat even weighty matters like a joke. There's an edge to them. They maintain a careful, calculated distance. Fear of intimacy keeps them from serious commitments and makes them wary of establishing lasting relationships. When the powerful emotions of grief are disavowed or withheld, all other feelings are repressed as well. It's impossible to deny some feelings and express others. When grief is suppressed, anger is buried along with it, as are joy and love. Over time, suppressed grief invades every facet of a child's life: academics, activities, relationships, emotional and physical health, and even dreams. Since more than half our Rainbow sites are in schools, we frequently hear from teachers and other school staff what grief looks like when a child or teen is in school. Here are some of the warning signs that teachers have observed that signal a student might be experiencing turmoil at home. Most of us recognize the obvious symptoms of grief, such as crying or sadness. But what about when a grieving 7-year-old throws a temper tantrum frequently, or a straight-A high school student refuses to do their homework? These responses are also signs of grieving. Although it may seem surprising, most behavior changes in grieving children are normal reactions to a significant loss. Unable to express their feelings and emotions, grieving children and teens act them out. This can be frustrating for the adults in their life, but it can also provide insight into the child's emotions. Dramatic shifts in demeanor can indicate unresolved issues of grief and anger, and it should be viewed and handled in that context. Behavioral changes may appear immediately after a loss, but more often they don't surface until several months later. In some instances, it can even take years. These are some of the telltale signs of normal behavior changes for the different age groups. Extreme behavior changes indicate serious problems. Not all grieving children and teens will exhibit extreme behavior changes, but all are at risk for them. These are some of the troubled responses to loss for the different age groups. Although we generally use the term children to refer to all youth under 18, teens certainly deserve to be recognized and as developmentally different from young children. Adolescence tends to be the most complicated, difficult period, and most teens feel insecure. They fear rejection, and they often mask their real feelings. Many teens find it hard to believe that they're accepted and worthwhile, and often they'll feel like they're not loved. Presented here are some of the changes experienced during normal teenage years. When a loss occurs during these teen years, the adolescent must cope with many additional burdens at an already challenging time. For the grieving teen, life can seem almost unbearable. Although a teen is struggling to establish their own separate identity, their self-image is still strongly linked to family. If the family unit disintegrates or is substantially changed during those formative years, the teen is left adrift. They may assure themselves that the loss doesn't matter because they're an adult, but in their heart, they yearn for a real family. If death or another type of loss occurs during adolescence, the teen is often pushed into an adult role as their parent's confidant or friend, or will feel the need to compensate for the loss of their sibling in some other way. Listed here are some of the primary things that are important to note about grief. Grief rises from the heart. Children cannot wish away the emotions that result from it. Grief demands understanding, guidance, and time. Grief acknowledges and honors the love of someone or something that is now absent from their lives. Grief's pain is deep. It is unlike any other suffering we endure. It carries its own agony. When we help children deal with grief in appropriate and life-giving ways, we teach them to be resilient. We provide them with invaluable lessons for life and prepare them for other life-challenging losses they will inevitably encounter in future years. Children and teens who learn how to grieve will not be overwhelmed by the pain of loss that strikes later in life. They will understand it, and they will know that they need to experience it in order to move through the process of grief. In Rainbows, we've identified 10 different phases that grieving youth experience. While many experts in the study of adult grief divide the grieving process into 5 or 6 stages, we find that to be too limiting to describe the chaotic cyclone of emotions and events affecting grieving children and teens, and not entirely accurate. It may seem logical to apply adult standards of grief to youth who've experienced loss, but this approach is simply not adequate. Children's grief is different. It plunges deeper and it spreads wider than that of adults. To understand grieving children, we need to confront the entire painful picture. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a pioneer in near-death studies, proposed that there are 5 stages of grief that people universally experience when they know they are dying. Her theory was later adopted to explain the process people go through when they're grieving any loss, not just the loss of their own life. While we feel there's value in her explanation, the truth is that not everyone will experience all 5 stages, nor do they have to reach the last stage of acceptance, as some have suggested, in order to move past their grief. In fact, one may never completely stop grieving. It is more often a process that continues throughout life, as grief can come and go at different points in life, when one has a profound memory of the person that's missing, or a remembrance of a special time together, or when a life event reminds one that the person is no longer there to experience that event with them. While coming to some sort of acceptance is important to being able to live a more normal life, it's not absolutely necessary. We mentioned the stages of grief in the training that we do with our group facilitators at Rainbows, but preface it by sharing that we use them to help explain some of the typical phases or normal emotions that one might experience when grieving. But grief is not a neat and orderly procedure. Although the 10 intervals of grief identified through Rainbow Sessions are presented here in loose chronological order, it's important to remember that the phases can just as easily follow a different pattern. Similarly, we must accept that there is no correct or appropriate amount of time that grieving youth should spend in each phase. One child might be mired in a particular stage for months or even years. Another will move quickly from one to the other and then hopscotch back through the entire emotional menu. Many of the stages are revisited again and again, and some may never be experienced at all. When the truth is too much to bear, children turn away. They deny that the loss has occurred. They refuse to listen to the very words they are being told. Denial is a buffer. It creates a safety zone where children can escape from reality until they're ready to absorb the painful truth of what has happened. Denial is a protective shield. In most instances, it makes no logical sense. To avoid confronting their loss, children and teens frequently use denial statements such as, my dad's a pilot, he's away now, but he'll be home soon. Or, Mom went on a trip for work, she'll be back. Often a child will shift suddenly from one dimension to the other, 1 minute accepting the loss event and denying it the next. Denying shapes behavior and is a normal response to loss. These are some of the telltale signs of denial. When the family is threatened by a life-altering traumatic event, children will do anything to make things right again. They think that they have the power to change or stop what is happening and will bargain with God or anyone that they feel has the power to affect what is occurring. They'll use whatever youthful chips they have to offer. These are some of the telltale signs of bargaining. In Rainbow Sessions over the years, we have consistently found that at least 90% of the children and teens in each group, regardless of the type of loss, feel some responsibility for the family crisis. Many assume the entire burden of guilt. Developmentally, children view themselves as a force that sends the world spinning. In their perspective, everything they do impacts those around them. Children and teens honestly believe that if they had behaved differently, received better grades at school, not quarreled with their siblings, or done their chores more readily, their loved ones would not have died. If parents are not honest about loss events, kids make up their own scenarios. The fantasies that grieving youth create are often more frightening than the truth itself, and usually have the children playing a major role in the drama. Feeling responsible for a family tragedy is an overwhelming burden to carry. Guilt hammers away at a child's self-esteem. It creates self-imposed emotional tyranny that burrows deep into the heart and can cause an ache that lasts a lifetime. After a death, even children who don't assume responsibility for the loss event may feel guilty about things done or not done. These are some of the telltale signs of guilt. Adults rely on a long string of accumulated life experiences to prepare for new circumstances, but children don't have that crutch. They're facing life events for the first time. More often than not, they really don't know what to expect. It's understandable then that new situations evoke feelings of fear and nervousness about how they'll cope and if they'll be able to get through the situation successfully. Often children's anxieties and fears stem from emotional neglect. During times of family crises, even the most attentive, dedicated parents may overlook their children's emotional needs. Emotionally distraught parents may reprimand inappropriately or discipline irrationally. They may be quick to anger or become reclusive. Their actions are not intentional, but the parents may be so torn themselves, so overwhelmed, so consumed by their own pain or worried about finances that they simply cannot cope with the full roster of duties and parental obligations that they once handled with ease. It's simply too much. In some instances, adults are unaware of the children's emotional pain. Children may be physically neglected as well, often unintentionally. Not being well cared for makes children fearful and anxious. Parents forget to buy groceries, and the hungry child finds nothing in the house to eat. Normal home-cooked family dinners become fast food most nights of the week. Parents forget to do laundry or to sign forms or permission slips for school activities. They may not have the time or energy to clean the house, so children accustomed to a well-organized household are forced to live in chaos. These are some of the telltale signs of fear. Many grieving children are angry at the world and nearly everyone in it. They're angry with their parents, friends, classmates, pets, teachers, and even God. Grieving children are angry that the loss event happened to them and their families. The strong emotion usually surfaces once the reality of the loss event has sunk in. Children realize that no amount of denial or bargaining will change the outcome. Many times the anger seems displaced, unreasonable, and unwarranted. But no matter how adults characterize and perceive this rage, the wrath is very real to children. The rage erupts at random and is displaced in all directions. They're angry with anyone and everyone. Anger is a normal reaction to loss. It is integral to the grieving process. Why shouldn't you be enraged that someone or something you loved has been taken away from you? Anger that is not properly channeled intensifies and becomes unmanageable as time passes. These are some of the signs of anger. A conspiracy of silence often descends on a family following a major loss. Families either tell children directly or subtly convey to them the message that they are not to speak about the person who has died because it's too upsetting. Some adults honestly believe that not talking will help children get over the trauma faster. Other factors can contribute to isolation, such as the remaining parent having more responsibilities and less time to devote to the child. Adults deliberately leaving children out of family discussions and decision-making processes, and children themselves withdrawing as a way of avoiding the changes that loss has imposed on family or personal life. These are some of the telltale signs of isolation. Children pine for the person or thing that is missing from their lives. Even a simple loss can make a child ache deeply for what is missing. These are some of the signs of pining. Children of loss often face an avalanche of change in their lives. As the landscape shifts around them, they wonder what else will go wrong. Almost every major family crisis packs a double wallop to the children. Even the most protective parent can't shelter a child from the winds of change. Children are profoundly affected, even when things are going well. These are some of the telltale signs of confusion. A significant loss sends a child's world spinning out of control. Everything they have held as normal or stable shifts and changes. Realizing they'll never recapture what has been lost, the child is filled with sadness. This usually signals that reality is settling in. Because of a lack of emotional maturity, children typically aren't able to grieve for long periods of time. As we said before, they have sad attacks. They may need time to work through their grief and should not be rushed through the process. Even if the process occurs intermittently over a long period of time. Acknowledgement of the loss event is a healthy sign as long as the child continues to move forward. Sometimes a child feels loss on so many levels that they become confused and overwhelmed by their emotions. At this point, the child may experience the intense and consuming sadness of depression. It's important for a depressed child to talk through the feelings of grief, working with a mental health professional if necessary. These are some of the signs of depression. Healthy mourning often takes years to complete. It's achieved when the grieving child has successfully moved through the phases of grief and has learned to accept the changes created by loss. Acceptance doesn't mean that they think what has happened is okay. It means that they acknowledge it and are able to assimilate the loss into their daily life. Acceptance is the period of healing that may come after the pain of loss has been dealt with. Acceptance helps free the child from the intense pain of the past and sets them on the road to a strong, healthy future. These are some of the telltale signs of acceptance. As children experience each phase of grief, they need us, the parents, the extended family, the community caregivers, to reach out and to help guide them on their journey. There are a number of losses that children may struggle with beyond the primary loss event, and these can often confuse and overwhelm them, so it's important to be aware of them. Children are robbed of their own childhoods. After there is a death in the family, children are often encouraged to take on parenting roles and adult housekeeping or decision-making responsibilities. Some are so heavily saddled with adult chores that they have no time to be children. Sometimes the children try to assume these adult roles on their own, feeling they have to step up and help out. Children lose a sense of who they are. A child's identity is intrinsically linked to their family. They think of themselves as being part of the family unit, linked by an emotional umbilical cord. The new identity can't be forged overnight. It takes time and nurturing. Children encounter celebration chaos. Life continues after the loss. There are birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays to observe, all of which can trigger painful memories and be challenging to maneuver through after loss. If a sibling has died and the parents are afloat in their own sea of guilt and grief, they may not be up to executing a holiday or celebration. The remaining children feel slighted. This omission compounds their pain. And lastly, children are often forced to make painful choices. A child may feel that they are being disloyal to the deceased parent if they accept new people in their life, or a deceased sibling too. Children don't experience the death of a family member just one at a time. At various stages in life, the feelings of loss may be rekindled or the memory of the event resurrected, triggering a sad attack. This can happen repeatedly as children mature and move into adulthood. It can be a recurring trigger for sadness and depression. We live as if death is uncertain and life is certain, but in reality, the opposite is true. Life is uncertain, but death is not. Eventually, everyone is touched by death, even children. By age 18, it's estimated that 1 in every 14 children will experience the death of a parent or sibling in the US. The death of an important person in a child's life leaves an indelible mark and becomes a life-defining event. In many instances, other significant occasions in their life are dated in their mind as before or after the death of that loved one. Having someone die is among the most stressful life experiences that a young person will encounter. For a child or adolescent, death is an incomprehensible event that represents inextricable emotional pain. How children cope with death depends on a number of factors, such as those listed here. Each of these elements must be taken into consideration when a child experiences the death of someone close. Each death will be processed differently. Each death is cloaked in its own unique circumstances and brings its own anguish. Our society doesn't like to talk about death. We pretend that it doesn't exist until, of course, someone we love dies and we're faced with it head on. When this happens, we are overwhelmed and in such great emotional distress, we are often rendered speechless. We can hardly help ourselves, much less offer guidance to the children who have also been touched by the event. Death is the last stage of life. We are going to die, and our family members are going to die. Avoiding the subject does not keep death away. These are some of the things that are important to consider when helping children cope with death. These are some of the things that children need to hear from adults about death. We can help them understand death by talking about what it does to the body. These kinds of concrete examples provide points of reference for a child. Children can visualize all these things happening, just as they can recall the image of a dead pet or a bird found in the yard. It's very important to never compare death to sleeping. Children interpret words literally. They fear that by going to sleep, they too will die. Even older children who haven't experienced the death of a family member or friend may have trouble understanding the finality of the event. Faced with a terminal illness or even death itself, they may ask, "Isn't there something the doctors can do?" Children will cope with the death of a family member most easily if they are told about the death as soon as possible, if they are told the truth, if the news is conveyed by a trusted adult, if the adults reassure the children that they will be cared for and loved, if the children's family and caregivers maintain normal routines such as mealtime and bedtime, as well as expected behavior and consequences. Continuity conveys a sense of normalcy and actually mitigates some of the children's fears. And the children's family or other caring adults make additional time to spend with them, to answer questions and provide companionship. Children must not feel isolated from the other members of the family as they mourn and grieve the loss. Unfortunately, there is no blueprint for guiding a child safely through the experience of losing someone. Each child is unique, and therefore each will have their own specific concerns and fears. These are some suggestions that can help ease the process as much as possible. The most important thing is to talk about the loss event and to get the child to talk about how they're feeling. Remember that children cannot take in and process events of this magnitude in one sitting. They're bound to be confused. Most helpful for them are conversations linked together over time. By demonstrating that you are always available to answer any questions that the children may have, or simply to listen to their thoughts, their worries, and their fears, you will be a reassuring source of strength to them at one of the most tumultuous points in their life. As we say at Rainbows, you can help guide a child through the storms of life. I encourage all of you to visit our website, www.rainbows.org, for more information on what we do at Rainbows for All Children and for resources to support families dealing with loss. You can use the Find a Group feature to search for a free support group in your area, but if there isn't one, please contact us and we'll be happy to get one started. There's a document in the resources page of the website called The Complex Phases of Children that summarizes some of the things mentioned in this presentation today. And I can also share it with the folks at SOFT in case any of you would like it. I also want to mention that there's a powerful documentary available for viewing for free from now through July 30th that's called Speaking Grief. You can find it at this address on the top of the slide here, or by searching WPSU, it's Penn State University, Grief on Facebook. It's an hour long, and then there's a second hour of a panel discussion by various experts following the film. This is aimed at those who care for grieving people, but it was also made to just generate awareness of the importance of recognizing grief and normalizing it. Bring your tissues. It will likely generate some tears, but it is very well done, and I highly recommend checking it out. Thank you so much for joining me today and listening to this presentation. We have a few minutes now for me to answer any questions or address any concerns that you might have. So I'm going to take us off the screen share so we can go ahead and do that. Okay. Does anybody have? Hi.
So I don't see any questions right now, and I'm not seeing anybody's hands raised. So we'll give them a little bit to maybe formulate some of their questions and see if anybody has anything to say.
Have either of you seen that documentary that I mentioned, Speaking Grief?
I have not. No.
No, I have not.
I want to check it out. It's really quite powerful. We have nothing to do with it, so I'm not like promoting it because of that. But it's some of our community partners that we work with developed it, and it's just an amazing film that I think pretty much everyone in the world should see it, because we all grieve and we need to know about how to grieve better, you know, and understand it better. But
we really truly are very untrained in that. As you were talking, I mean, I'm at point times cringing because of the fact that I realize myself, you're talking about having conversation, and I'm thinking, oh, those are so hard to do, and remembering, and you know, it's really important to be aware and be educated on how to do this.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I think the takeaway message, if I could just say just one thing to do, it's really just to listen to kids and to prompt them to keep talking about it. What I think is so devastating is when we hear from families that they're like, oh no, we don't talk about it at all. And that's the worst thing you can possibly do. And I know that their intention is good. You know, they don't want to hurt them, or they don't want to provoke anything or continue the pain, or, you know, I think even we as community members do that to one another sometimes, that we're like, oh no, I don't want to upset them. They want to talk about the person, you know, they want to remember that memory, and that the child that they lost, or the parent that they lost, or whatever it was. You know, we all need to talk about it and talk about our feelings.
And I think that's what why we place at SOFT, we place such importance on doing things like a candle lighting ceremony or a balloon release, just so people can hear their child's name spoken out loud and just celebrate that child still. And so we really try really hard to keep those things in mind.
Absolutely. That we all remember.
Mm-hmm.
I love that you did the candlelight ceremony last night. I think that's amazing. It's great. Well, no questions, I guess. If anybody decides they want to ask questions later, our email is info@rainbows.org, or you can go to the website. I'm happy to talk with anybody offline if that's more comfortable. And as I say, there's lots of resources on that website too. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Thank you so much for doing this presentation, and thank you so much for everything that you've shared with us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. You all take care.
Thank you, you too. I just want to let everybody know that we do have a lot of events happening today. Right after this event, we will be having our Soft Friends Quilt, where we will be talking about what we're going to organize for that. Then Dr. Carey will be giving his talk on trisomy 18 and trisomy 13 later on this afternoon. And then Dr. Stephen Braddock will be doing his talk on tumors and trisomy 18 early this evening. So if you haven't registered for those sessions, you can head on over to trisomy.org and still get yourself registered for those sessions. And we will be seeing everybody later. Thank you very much.
All right, take care. Thanks.